Hello everyone, I'm Roy Barton. I'm President of the Institute of Value Management Australia. Welcome to part 2 of this series on value and value for money. The purpose of this second presentation is to describe the step-by-step process of determining best value for money. In the first presentation, I laid down some basic principles about value and value for money, and now we're going to start working through the steps, the step-by-step process of determining best value for money from a range of options. First, a quick recap of part 1. The most important part of part 1 was this value triangle. This value triangle captures 3 separate factors: useful purpose, beneficial outcomes, and important features and characteristics. It's the combination of those 3 factors that helps us to identify the value of literally anything, whether that anything is this little gadget in my hand that's used for moving these PowerPoint slides on, or whether the anything is a whole new road scheme or a new hospital or whatever it might be. We can always determine where the value lies by identifying these 3 factors. Please note the point that I made in the first presentation, that value is very much a matter of perception, because what may be of value to one person may be of no value at all to another. What may be of use to one may be of no value to another or no use to another. And similarly with benefits and important features. It's very much a matter of individual perception, and we'll be getting on to that a little later. From that triangle, we produce what I describe as a value statement. And these value statements may be used to guide planning and design decisions and to form the basis for comparisons in determining value for money. The value statement simply lists the useful purposes of the entity, the benefits that the entity brings, and the important features or characteristics of the entity. Later in this series, we'll get into some case studies, and you'll see when we're producing these value statements how we bring a group of stakeholders together to identify those purposes collectively, to identify the benefits collectively, and to identify the important features or characteristics collectively. But that's coming a little later. As for now, please keep in mind the value triangle and the value statement. This diagram was also an important part of the first presentation, and it demonstrates the separation of value and money, which is fundamental to this method. On the one side, here we see the value. Here's the value, here's the money. Here's the value, here's the money. The value is defined by the useful purposes, the beneficial outcomes, and the important features. Money doesn't come into it. The second part of it is to say, well, how much will these entities cost, which reflect the value triangle? And of course, there are a number of options which cost different amounts of money. So we see our value on the one side and money on the other side. And our question is, are we getting value for our money? We now move into part 2 of the presentation. And I asked the question, why is value for money important? Seemingly everyone seeks it. At the supermarket, at the restaurant, in all procurement, in statements of project requirements, in design briefs, in just about everything. But how do we determine best value for money from a range of options? That's what this series is about. Well, what we do, we compare each option. There are always options. We compare each option on the basis of more or less value. That is to say, one option will provide more of the value triangle than another. And we compare that with the total cost. And of course, each of those options will cost more or less than the others. So we're looking for the best ratio of the value to the total cost, the best ratio of value to total cost. That's an important notion to keep in mind, and we'll explore that as we go through the step-by-step process. But essentially what we're doing is taking our value statement, looking at options to deliver it, recognizing that those options will provide more or less of the value required, and they'll do it for more or less total costs. Now, before we move on, I just want to define what we mean by total cost. This is how we've defined it in the Australian Standard. Total cost includes the costs of planning, acquisition, development, operations, staffing, consumables, energy, maintenance and disposal, and also takes account of the cash flow profile and the risk mitigation strategy, for there are costs there as well. Now, I have to say that it is rare on major construction projects for all those things to be taken into account. Very rare indeed. Most clients on construction projects are interested primarily in the capital costs of construction, and that's it. We don't normally get into the operation and staffing, say, over the next 10, 20 years, but some projects do, particularly health projects, where we've been looking at planning and design of new hospitals, where the operation, staffing and consumables have certainly been a major issue over the life of the hospital. And so sometimes these total costs do get factored in, but other cases, the clients are simply interested in the capital costs. We can apply these steps, whatever the clients choose to do. So then here are the steps in determining best value for money, and there are 6 of them. The first, we set up a value statement. Second, we select options. Third, we assess the extent of the value provided by each option. Fourth, we assess the total costs of each option. 5, we compare the options. And 6, we decide which gives best value for money. Now, this framework will apply to any situation. We use this framework within the steps of an overall value management study, but you can take this framework and use it anywhere, whether you're doing formal value management or not. Okay, so let's look then at the first one, which is to set up a value statement. We bring together a group of stakeholders for the project. That may be a small group of people, 5 or 6, or in some cases it might be 40 or 50, into a workshop situation, as in the case, let's say, of a brand new hospital, very early stages, lots of stakeholders. We bring them all together, we run workshops, and we capture these notions. We bring the group to consensus on useful purpose. This is the primary purpose of this particular entity. It is why it exists. It is its raison d'etre. This is really, really important, because that purpose statement will guide the whole process from there on. We then recognize that as a result of fulfilling those useful purposes, benefits will flow. Beneficial outcomes will accrue, and we want to identify them. We want to identify them from multiple perceptions and capture them all, recognizing that what is a benefit to one may not be a benefit to another, but they need to go into the value statement. And similarly with the important features and characteristics. And we've got workshop techniques to do all of that, and we'll show you that in later sessions. As for now, we're just looking at the steps. The second one is to select options. We have a process, must have a process to identify and develop options, including generating and evaluating ideas. Then we want to select more than one option to go forward for detailed comparison. In a formal value management study, we go through a process of generating a lot of ideas, 100 ideas or so we may easily generate, but then we'll whittle that down into a number of specific options that we want to take forward for comparison. And it's when we get to that stage of having the options clearly identified that we can start doing the comparison. However you do that is up to you. If you're not doing it within a value management context, well, then you may be just picking out 3 or 4 options that are of interest to you and carrying out this sort of analysis. If you're doing it in a value management study, well, then we've got a process to do that. However you do it, you need to end up with a number of options for comparison. We then want to assess the extent of value provided by those options. You may well find, for example, let's say one of the options provides you with 150% of what you're after. Another one may provide, say, 95% of what you're after. But the 95%, even though it doesn't give you exactly all of your requirements, may still deliver best value for money, because let's say it might cover half the cost of the other. Let me just give you an example of what I'm getting at from a very, very practical situation, namely the purchase of a breakfast in a hotel or hotel restaurant or little cafe next door. I was staying at a hotel in Sydney last year, and a nice hotel, and I'd just go down for breakfast, and they have this a staggering array of food available for breakfast. Across the road, however, there's a little cafe. Now, across the road, in that cafe, they happen to deliver exactly the sort of breakfast that I was seeking, namely some nice scrambled eggs and bacon and some barista brewed coffee. Beautiful. Over in the hotel, I have to go and serve myself from this vast self-service, and it's got far more than ever I would require. So this is the situation. Over in the cafe, they're providing literally exactly what I was looking for breakfast. And they're providing it for half the cost of the hotel. Now, at the hotel, the breakfast, you would have to say, was a much better breakfast because of all the options that they provided. But the point is that I didn't want them. They would not be on my value statement. So from a value for money perspective, for me personally, the cafe across the road was much better value for money. At the hotel, there may be other people who just love that array of food, loved it. They could go and have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and stay there for for an hour or so, picking on all those things. And for them, if that was part of their value statement, then it would be worth paying the extra money for. So you see the idea of perception and choice. The cafe for me provided exactly what I wanted, 100% of what I wanted for 50% of the cost of the hotel. Clearly, it was a much better value for money choice. So whatever we're looking at, we assess the extent, in percentage terms usually, of the value provided by each of the options. We determine the best value for money by making these comparisons. These costs may be expressed in absolute or relative terms, depending on the actual circumstances. In the next presentation, we're going to get into a measurement of value for money, and I'll be presenting some ways in which we measure these things. But we want to assess the total cost of each of the options. So in my cafe breakfast, I can tell you that option A was about $12 Australian. Option B was about $25 to $30 Australian. There was no option C. It was just one or the other. Interestingly, as I said, option B cost twice as much as option A, whereas option A provided me with 100% of my value statement. So you can see where we're going on this and the way we can actually determine best value for money. The interesting thing, by the way, about that breakfast is that I was sitting there thinking about the value for money as I had the breakfast. But when I left the breakfast, I went back into the hotel to meet with some colleagues where we were meeting about multi-billion-dollar mining projects, discussing value for money. Now, this is the thing. The principles that I used in determining the best value for money for my breakfast were exactly, and I mean exactly the same principles that we used to talk about best value for money in the multi-billion-dollar mining situation. The model is that which I presented to you. Here's our value, here's our money. And so we can apply this to, as I say, to literally anything. So when we've done that, we've established a percentage of value covered by each option. We've identified the cost of each option, and now we compare the options. We compare the selected options considering the value provided by each option and the cost of providing these options. Now, this comparison will always involve judgment. Always involve judgment. It's not something that we simply calculate. There may be calculations along the way, and I'll discuss this in the next presentation. But the ultimate decision, the final decision, is when people exercise their professional judgment and say that in our view, this option delivers much better value for money than this option, in exactly the way that I explained about the breakfast. I looked at it and I had certain calculations about the cost of the breakfast in either situation, but ultimately I took the decision the cafe will provide much better value for money. And so step 6 is that we then decide which option gives us best value for money. And that, as I say, is on the basis of judgment. So we've gone through this process. We've set up our value statement by identifying that value triangle with a group of people. The people have determined the value statement. We've identified options and we've selected some options to be considered. We've assessed the value provided by each of those options. We've assessed the cost of each option. We've then done the comparison, and finally, step 6, we've made the judgment. The decision will come from us exercising our judgment. Okay, so there are the 6 steps which we're going to employ. In the next presentation, I'm going to get more into some detail about the way in which we measure within those separate steps. That will then set the scene for us taking you into some case studies and practical examples. So that's it for this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.